Welcome to the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication at Rice University. In this episode, Richard Young will share what interactional competence is and how to use this approach for second language teaching. Before proceeding to the video, let's think about how other issues will influence a person's interactional competence. What do the following mean to you? Linguistic competence, discourse competence, pragmatic competence, strategic competence, and communicative competence.
Now, just talking a little bit about what we understand by competence, and the word competence has been used quite extensively by various different people. This is the man who basically got us started talking about competence, Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky said, you have to distinguish between what people know in the abstract and what people actually do. And he distinguished between competence, which he called what people know in the abstract, is some sort of mental configuration that people have, a cognitive thing, and then actually what people do. And he said, of course, there is some connection between what people do and what is in their minds, but it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily know what people know by asking them to do stuff. So he distinguished between competence and performance. The person who criticized Chomsky is Del Hymes, because Hymes said, obviously we do have some sort of abstract knowledge of the language, but at the same time we have some knowledge about how to use the language. And if we don't have that knowledge about how to use the language, then the language that we know is useless. And he said, there are rules of use without which the rules of grammar are useless. And maybe those of you who've learned a second language have had experience of that. That is, you've learned the grammar, you've learned the vocabulary, but you've never actually learned how to use that. Cornelius Swain borrowed Hymes's idea and said, okay, well, in language learning, we also have communicative competence. And in order to understand communicative competence, they specified it as linguistic competence, which is basically what Chomsky was talking about. Discourse competence, that is how you string sentences together to form conversations, or how you form text and paragraphs in writing. How you do pragmatic competence, that is how you establish in communication what people are actually meaning, even if they're not saying exactly what they mean. And then strategic competence, which is, we all find from time to time that we don't know what we should say. We've forgotten the word. This happens in our native language as in any other language.
I didn't realize that knowing vocabulary and grammar is not enough to be a good communicator. What other features of language do I need to know to become a competent member of a community?
Okay, now interactional competence has built on Cornelius Swain's idea of communicative competence. So interactional competence says, yes, there are certain things that we know about communicating with language, but we can go beyond Cornelius Swain's model. And these features of interactional competence have been listed in this particular way. People have talked about a participation framework, and I'll explain these things as we go along. The register that people are using in a particular discursive practice, the modes of meaning, that is how they are creating different kinds of meaning in interaction, the speech acts, that is the kind of things that they are doing with the kind of social actions that they're doing with their language, and how they're sequencing those acts. Turn-taking, obviously, is a very important part when you're talking about spoken interaction, that people do take turns, but we know from the work, this is extensive work that's been done in conversation analysis, that turn taking is has a regular structure, and we know that if people talk at the same time, they do it only at they stop talking at the same time fairly soon. Repair is when there's trouble in interaction, and what do we do about it? Okay? And then lastly, boundaries. Now, boundaries have to do with the fact that when we're looking at interactional competence, we're looking at a particular practice. Now, practice is something I mentioned yesterday, and what I mean by practice is something which is bounded and which often has a name. So, for example, telling a joke has a name, and a boundary of telling a joke has a beginning and has an end. So, you often start a joke by saying, okay, I want to tell you this one, okay? So you begin it with a particular action, and you end it, hopefully, with some sort of laughter, okay? Some sort of punchline and some sort of laughter. So that's an example of a boundary. Let's have a look at those things in detail. A participation framework. Now, we're used to thinking of conversations sort of like scripts, So A says this, B says this, then A says something else, then C chimes in, etc. We kind of think of those things as a sort of a play script. And that's okay. But of course, when you look at the different kinds of participation that people are doing, then they're doing very many different things. So the participation framework is the identities of all participants in an interaction. This is important, whether they are actually present or not. That is actually whether they are saying anything. Whether they are official or unofficial, whether they're ratified or unratified, and their footing or identities in the interaction. Okay, register. Now, register is something that I think we're all familiar with, and that register is basically the pronunciation, the features of pronunciation of vocabulary or grammar that typify a practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that you always use the same words, the same grammar, the same pronunciation in a practice, but there are things, if you're telling a joke, if you're inviting somebody to go and see a movie, if you're trying to find a parking place and you ask somebody, then there are certain things that you use more than other things. And these are features of pronunciation, features of grammar, and features of vocabulary. So when we look at the register of a particular discursive practice, we want to know what's the vocabulary. And if we don't know the vocabulary, we have to somehow get around it some way, if we use our strategic competence in order to get around that knowledge that we don't have. The modes of meaning is something that I borrowed from Michael Halliday. Michael Halliday in Systemic Functional Grammar talks about the ways that people create different kinds of meaning not only in speech but also in writing. And he talked about basically three different kinds of ways of creating meaning. He talked about interpersonal meaning, and we do interpersonal meaning by, for example, using pronouns like I and you and things like that. We use pronouns like his and her, etc. So basically, in interpersonal meaning, we're trying to we're trying to communicate by means of a question, for example, or by means of a glance. We are recognizing that the other person is there, and we are trying to influence the other person in some way. Experiential meaning is basically just describing, the world, and also describing our experience of the world. That is, if I was late today, I would have to say I was late. I'm basically describing the experience of being late. If as we get towards noon, you feel some rumbling in your tummy and you think, oh, I feel hungry. Well, that once again is experiential meaning. Textual meaning is how things string together to form texts. So therefore, if you refer to something which went before, that's textual meaning. If you're talking about something which is in the future, then that would be some kind of textual meaning as well. Speech acts. Now, here we're basically I'm borrowing on work that's been done on conversation analysis, And speech acts, as you probably know, were originally put forward as something like, how to do things with words, and people thought that a speech act, you did something, one utterance was one speech act. We obviously know that's not true anymore. But we do know that in any conversation, there are certain speech acts that people select in a conversation, and they sequence them in a particular way. And if they sequence them in a different way, it means something else. So it's a question of what acts you select and how you organize them, what you put first, what you put second, what you put third, etc. Turn-taking is something that I mentioned before, and turn-taking basically is, if you are in a conversation, how does the next speaker get to take the floor? How does the next speaker get to talk? Well, there are several ways. If you are the first speaker, then you can select the speaker in some way by asking a question, by gazing at that person, by naming that person. Obviously, in informal conversation, the turns are much shorter, but you do know when a turn is heading towards an end, and sometimes you jump in before that turn comes to an end, but nobody hears that as an interruption, because people are predicting how that turn is going to end. Lastly, we all know that there are certain things that we either disagree with or we don't understand in conversation, and we, in some cases, not in all cases, we sometimes repair. One of the disadvantages of teaching like this as a lecture is there are probably many things that I'm talking about that either you disagree with or you don't understand. But, in a lecture, you don't say anything, right? You don't repair in a lecture. That's one of the things that doesn't repair in a lecture. Because of the structure of the interaction, the repair part comes maybe at the end, or maybe it doesn't come. Of course, that's a real problem when you're teaching a language, because very often if you're teaching a foreign language and the students don't understand what's going on, what are they going to say? If you're in a teacher-directed class, then it's hard for the students to repair. Boundaries, we talked about before. That is how you know when something begins, how you know when something ends, how you know when you're moving from one thing to another thing. So I'd like you, if you haven't done already, to remember those 7 resources. Okay? Participation framework, register, modes of meaning, speech acts, turn taking, repair, and boundaries, because we're going to try to use that framework to try to understand some discursive practices.
So, if I master all these 7 resources, will I be a good communicator?
There is more, and that is intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity basically means, and this is something which was brought up by Claire Crumbsh, and Claire Crumbsh first of all talked about intersubjectivity in this way. She recognized that interactional competence presupposes a shared internal context or sphere of intersubjectivity, and this view is what most clearly distinguishes interactional competence from previous theories of competence. What she means is, and once again, interactional competence, the idea of intersubjectivity has been taken up by conversation analysts, because what we assume with intersubjectivity is that basically I have a good guess what's in your mind. So when I talk about something and you talk about something, I hope that we have some sort of common understanding. This is so. Psychologists have talked about this as a theory of mind. That is, I have a theory of what's in your head. You probably have a theory of what's in my head. We could be wrong. Our theories could be wrong. But what we try to do in interaction is we try to establish where that sphere of intersubjectivity is. So intersubjectivity in communication requires that the receiver should come to attend to the situation as intended by the speaker. Okay? So basically we're attending to the same thing in a similar way. The sender should know that the receiver is so doing, and the receiver should know that the sender knows that this is the case. So basically it means that we're able to see what's going on.
As an instructor, How can I apply this knowledge to my teaching?
When you are doing analyzing the participations framework, the discursive structure, so if you have some material, and it could be audio material, could be video material, could even actually simply be a series of stills, then you can use that as a basis for developing materials with your students, for your students rather. What are the particular discursive practices that you think would be useful for your particular students? Think about the kind of practices, the kind of discursive practices, things that have beginnings, things that have an end, things that have a well-rounded structure that you could use, and you could use this framework in order to develop lesson plans around that. So think about that.
Let's review what Richard Young shared with us. There are 7 resources that participants bring to an interaction. They are participation framework, register, modes of meaning, speech acts, turn-taking, repair, and boundaries. We hope you learn that exposure to the language itself is not enough for language instruction. Social context is important, and the second language classroom can be a great place to practice. Thank you for watching